In this video, we're going to talk about the immune system, specifically talking about barrier defenses and the innate immune system that functions with them. So, the immune system can be divided up into really three different um, components. So, you have barrier defenses. These are things like function kind of like walls or a moat would around a castle. It is preventing anything to come in there because it's forming a barrier of some sort. So this includes things like your skin and mucous membranes. It's passively functioning to prevent pathogenic invasion. However, the more active part of the immune system is going to rely on your innate immune response as well as your adaptive immune response. So, innate immune is sort of like sentinels that are going to be set out in front of the castle, always on the lookout for something that's not supposed to be there. So this type of response tend to be very rapid but non-specific, and you're going to see a variety of specialized cells as well as some soluble factors that are involved in this. And then the adaptive immune response, these are going to be like the special agents, or what I show here is archers. They are going to be slower, but they're more specific. They can identify and recognize enemies that they've seen in the past. So these archers may have been trained specifically against one particular enemy that is coming in, just like your lymphocytes will be targeting a specific enemy that is coming into the gates. So that makes up the adaptive immune response. All right, so your barrier defenses, most superficially, your skin is going to act as a barrier defense, but you also have things like your hair, which is going to bind things and prevent them from going in, your mucus, and other things that are going on. So first of all, let's look at what's going on at the skin. So first of all, you have your keratinized cells as well as the Langerhans cells, which are sort of like the resident macrophages that are residing in the skin that are protecting your body just by being there. In addition to that, you have several secretions. Sweat and sebaceous glands secrete different chemicals, which are going to have a low pH and ultimately are going to help defend the body by preventing things that would thrive in the more neutral environment inside the body from taking hold to eventually enter. In the mouth, so you have your oral cavity. You produce saliva there that contains lysozyme, as well as having the washing action that could potentially act as a defense against it. And then you have your stomach acid that you find in your stomach. So this has a low pH, this is going to act as a barrier. And then you have different mucosal surfaces. These contain non-keratinized epithelial cells, but your cells, even though they're not keratinized, still are acting as a barrier to further infiltration. And then something that's not technically a part of you, but makes up a large part of your normal cellular components are going to be the non-pathogenic bacteria that reside on the mucosal surfaces that basically take up residence there and are preventing other bacteria that may be harmful from getting a foothold to begin with. So those are your barrier defenses that, again, are just there and are not something that you typically need to worry about unless they've been damaged in some way, such as when you get a cut. When the barrier defenses fail, then your internal defenses are going to start taking over. So your innate immune system has several of these internal defenses. These are going to include things like the mast cell and the basophils. These are things that are going to release granules and chemicals that are going to help with inflammation. You have natural killer cells, which are going to be playing a specialized role in killing off certain infected cells. You have the complement system, which is acellular, but is going to work with the cells as well as perform its own function to help drive the innate immune system. And then you have different phagocytes, things that are going to take up and ultimately engulf invaders like your monocyte, well, your macrophages that are derived from monocytes and your neutrophils. So let's look at where these different immune cells come from. So starting off with the hematopoietic stem cell, it's going to divide into the myeloid stem cell lineage and the lymphoid stem cell lineage. The myeloid stem cell lineage over here is going to ultimately give rise to your platelets, your red blood cell, but it also gives rise to some of these granulocytes, your eosinophils and your basophils. Then you have the lymphoid stem cell. That's going to give rise to a lymphoblast, which gives rise to the natural the natural killer cell, as well as the lymphocytes that play a role in the adaptive immune response. New evidence is also showing that it may also be the precursor to the monocyte and the neutrophil, which are going to act as phagocytotic cells. All right, so let's start off with the granulocytes. So these are cells that are going to have different granules that they store in vesicles that ultimately are going to be released to help aid in the immune response. So first of all, one thing I haven't mentioned is mast cells. So this is actually a different lineage than you see for the other things, but it also contains secretory granules and release things like histamine and heparin that play a role in it. The granulocytes include the basophil, eosinophil, and neutrophil. The basophil is a white blood cell that aids in inflammatory responses, releases things like histamine, serotonin, and heparin. The eosinophil is going to play a role mostly against multicellular parasites. It's going to release chemicals that ultimately attack these different cells. And then neutrophils, these are white blood cells that are going to function by phagocytosis, but they also have some other functions like release of their granules and a kind of nifty trick where they actually will expel their nuclear contents and form a net, kind of. It's abbreviated net, but or denoted as net, but kind of a literal net that traps invading pathogens. All right, the phagocytic cells include the neutrophil and the macrophages. The neutrophil is a granulocyte. It primarily is going to act in blood and is going to be one of the first lines of defense that the body has. The macrophages are derived from monocytes. These are both agranulocytes. The macrophages is going to be found more in the body cavities and organs, while the monocytes are going to be found more in the blood. Now, the macrophages may have different names depending on what tissue they're in. So you have things like Kupffer cells in the lungs, alveolar macrophages in the lungs, histiocytes in connective tissue, as well as many other different names for the macrophages, just depending on where they are. All right, in the natural killer cell, which is derived from a lymphoblast, this is a cell that can induce apoptosis in virus and obligate intracellular bacteria infected cells. So if the cell is infected with something that's inside of it, the natural killer cell can recognize this. So it does this because the expression of the Fas ligand, so this is a surface molecule that binds to the Fas molecule on the surface of the infected cell, sending it apoptotic signals. Ultimately, this results in the release of the granules. Two things that they have are perforin. This is a protein that forms pores in the membranes of infected cells, and granzyme. This is a protein digested enzyme that enters the cell via the pores that are made and helps to further kill the cell. So how do the cells recognize pathogens? Well, Pathogens generally have a feature that is known as a pattern recognition molecule. So this is going to be something that features so the pattern recognition receptor is going to be something that recognizes characteristic features of the pathogen. So it might recognize a bacteria cell wall, for example, and therefore that is going to be how they respond. There's limits to this, so each receptor type must be encoded by a specific gene and requires the cell to allocate DNA to making this recognizable. This means that you're going to have a limited variety of receptors, both in what can be expressed as well as what can actually be found on the surface of the cell membrane. Now, the adaptive immune response gets by this in a number of different ways. We'll talk about that in another video. But the innate immune system gets by on this limited number of receptors, but is still going to be active against a wide variety of pathogens, since many of these molecules that the pattern recognition receptors recognize are going to be shared by many different pathogens. The soluble mediators or chemical mediators of innate immunity are going to include things like cytokines and chemokines. So these are signaling molecules. A cytokine allows cells to communicate with each other over short distances, while a chemokine is going to act much longer distances. Both of these do tend to draw cells via chemotaxis or activate them. Interferons are another protein component. So this is going to be something that's expressed early on, and cells that are infected with viruses will start producing and secreting these interferons. This clues other cells that you need to start making antiviral proteins, and will help draw some of the innate immune system cells to that cell to get rid of it. And then another powerful soluble mediator is the complement system, which is actually a series of proteins that are going to act in a couple of different ways. So complement system, these proteins are primarily made in the liver. There's two pathways. There's the classical pathway, which requires antibodies to become activated. The alternative pathway does not require antibodies. So when we talk about the innate immune system, we're talking about the alternative pathway. They work in a number of different ways. So one is by opsonization. This is where it binds and labels the pathogen, making it more suitable for phagocytosis. So I always like to think of Emeril Lagasse going, bam, he's opsonizing the food, making it tasty for other people to take it up. Well, that's what opsonization is just bam, making those pathogens more tasty. They also are going to act as chemotactic, so things that are going to attract phagocytic cells, and they form damaging pores in the plasma membrane, which then make it so that the cell will ultimately lyse, and you can get things inside the cell that are going to cause it to die. So complement system, the invading pathway involves an antigen and antibodies binding to the C1 protein, and this then triggers C2 and C4 to split into two different components. Fragments from C2 and C4 are then going to combine to form what is known as C3 convertase. So this is going to make that C3 convertase. Now, the alternative pathway is going to be triggered when spontaneously active C3 interacts with other complement factors on the surface program. So everything after this is common in the classical pathway as well as the alternative pathway. It's just that the alternative pathway does not require antibodies while the classical pathway does. All right, so now really I should just take off the classical pathway off the top here, since it is both pathways that are being shared. So C3 convertase splits C3 into two, forming C3b, which can bind to the pathogen, causing opsonization. C3A is also going to attract phagocytes to the area so that they can engulf it. C3b, in addition to that, will combine with the C3 convertase prior to become C5 convertase. C5 convertase then splits C5 into two, and you have C5a and C5b. C5a ultimately is going to join C6, C7, C8, and C9 to form the membrane attack complex. This is a complex which is basically going to put a hole in the plasma membrane of the pathogen. This allows water to rush in, allowing the pathogen to lyse. Also lets other chemicals get in there to cause apoptosis to occur. All right. Inflammation is a hallmark of the innate response, has 4 characteristics: heat, redness, pain, swelling. You can also oftentimes add loss of function to this because it does, sometimes limited by the pain and the swelling itself, result in a disability and unable to completely move that part of the body or do what that part of the body normally does. Acute inflammation is short-term and is response, but chronic inflammation can occur when it ongoes. This can be caused by several different things, including foreign bodies, persistent pathogens, and more nefarious, in my opinion. You have the autoimmune diseases and rheumatoid arthritis, which is when the chronic inflammation is triggered by the body itself. So how inflammation typically starts is with mast cells detecting injury to a nearby cell. This releases histamine, which initiates the inflammatory response. Histamine does a few things, but one thing it does is that it is going to increase blood flow to the wound sites, bringing phagocytes and other immune cells there that help neutralize the pathogen. This is why you get the influx of blood causing the wound to swell. When it swells, it's going to become reddened since there's more blood there. It also becomes warm and painful because you have these different responses going on. The tissue injury portion of the inflammatory response is when you're going to release the contents of injured cells, thus recruiting mast cell, stimulating the release of the mast cell granules and the mediators such as histamine. Histamine is going to act as a vasodilator, as I previously mentioned. This makes the swelling increase. Also, the increased vascular permeability leads to the swelling or the edema. And then the last thing is the recruitment of phagocytes. So this just kind of summarized what we saw on the previous slide. All right, so that does it for the innate immune system and the barrier defenses. In the next video, we will start talking about the adaptive immune response.